The night they put handcuffs on me, my own son stood on the porch and watched. He didn't look away. He didn't say a word in my defense. My daughter-in-law was screaming about a baby that never got the chance to be born, and everyone in that house believed I was the monster who took it from her. 2 years. That's how long I sat in a cell for something I never did. And every single month the two of them drove up to that prison to see me. Every single month I told the guard the same thing. Send them home. What none of them knew was that I was counting the days too, just not for the reason they thought. The day my son destroyed his own father. My name is Richard Callahan. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life, I built things. Not metaphorically, I mean I actually built things with my hands at first, and later with a company that employed 400 people across the state of Texas. Callahan Construction went up from nothing. I started with a used pickup truck and a business loan my own father co-signed against his better judgment. And by the time I was 55, we were pouring foundations for office parks and putting up steel for warehouses that stretched a quarter-mile long. I was proud of that. Prouder maybe than I should have let myself be, because pride has a way of blinding a man to what's happening in his own house. When I turned 63, I decided it was time to step back. My knees weren't what they used to be. My doctor had opinions about my blood pressure. And I had one son, Ethan, who I believed was ready to carry the company forward. I didn't hand him the keys because I was tired of working. I handed him the keys because I loved him and because I wanted to see him become the man I always believed he could be while I was still around to watch it happen. Ethan had married Olivia 2 years before that. She was smart, sharp-tongued in a way I liked, the kind of woman who challenged him instead of just agreeing with everything he said. In the beginning, I thought she was good for him. I thought a lot of things back then that I've since had to unlearn. For a while, it really was good. Sunday dinners at my house, Ethan talking about contracts he'd landed, Olivia laughing at something on her phone and reading it out loud to us. Then she told us she was pregnant, and I remember exactly where I was standing in my kitchen when she said it by the sink drying a coffee mug, and I nearly dropped it. A grandchild. After Ethan's mother passed, I'd started to think I might not get many more reasons to feel that kind of joy again. That baby was one. I don't know exactly when things started to sour between Ethan and Olivia. Marriages have their own private weather, and outsiders, even fathers, only see the storms that spill out into the yard. But I started noticing things. Olivia getting quiet at dinner. Ethan snapping at her over nothing, then apologizing too fast the way people do when they know they've crossed a line they've crossed before. I told myself it was stress. New baby coming, company pressures. The ordinary friction of two people building a life. I was wrong to dismiss it, and I've had 2 years in a small cell to sit with that mistake. The night everything fell apart, I was at their house because Ethan had called me over to look at some numbers on a bid we were losing money on. I remember the specific ache in my lower back from the drive, the smell of something Olivia had been cooking that never made it to the table. I remember hearing voices raised upstairs before I'd even gotten out of my truck. By the time I walked in, they were already in it, not screaming exactly, but that low, vicious kind of arguing where every word is aimed to wound. I called up the stairs. I told them to stop. I heard Olivia's voice crack, heard her say something about being tired of being lied to, and then I heard footsteps moving fast toward the top of the staircase. What happened next took maybe 4 seconds, and it changed the rest of my life. I saw her at the top of the stairs, one hand on the railing, and something about the way she moved told me she was about to lose her footing. I did what any of us would do. I moved toward her fast, my hand going up instinctively to catch whatever I could reach. I didn't touch her. I want to be clear about that even now, even though for 2 years almost no one believed me. I didn't get close enough. She went down hard, tumbling most of the flight, and the sound she made when she landed is a sound I still hear some nights when the prison is quiet and there's nothing else to fill the silence. There was blood. There was Ethan screaming her name and then screaming something else, screaming at me, screaming that I pushed her. In the chaos of that moment, with Olivia sobbing and clutching her stomach with sirens already somehow audible in the distance, I don't think Ethan even understood what he was saying. But he kept saying it. At the hospital, he said it to the doctors. He said it to the police. And a neighbor, a man named Curtis Abelman, who lived 2 houses down and had apparently heard the argument through his open window, told the responding officers he'd seen an old man near the top of the stairs right before the girl fell. That was enough. Combined with Ethan's accusation, combined with Olivia losing the baby that same night in a hospital hallway, while I sat handcuffed to a chair in the waiting room. It was enough to arrest me before the sun came up. I remember the cold metal on my wrists. I remember the officer's grip on my arm, firm, but not unkind the way you might hold someone you feel a little sorry for. And I remember looking back at my son, standing on that porch in the blue and red wash of the patrol lights, his face pale, his hands shaking, and saying nothing to stop what was happening to me. I didn't yell. I didn't fight it. I just looked at him, and something in me went very still and very cold, the way water goes still right before it freezes. Someday, I said, "You're going to wish you never did this." He didn't answer. The car door closed and Texas rolled by outside the window, and I understood somewhere in that long, silent drive to the county jail that the son I raised was gone, replaced by someone who would rather believe a lie than defend his own father. 2 years in hell. Prison strips a man down to whatever is actually inside him. There's no company title in there, no reputation, no 40 years of being known as a fair boss and a decent neighbor. In there, I was just another old man in a jumpsuit, and for the first few weeks, that's exactly how the other inmates treated me, like something to be tested, sized up, maybe pushed around a little to see what I was made of. I won't pretend those early days weren't hard. I was 63 years old, sharing a cell with a man half my age who'd been in and out of the system since he was 17. The food was the kind of gray, flavorless mass that makes you grateful for nothing, except that it's over quickly. The nights were the worst, that particular silence, that isn't silence at all, but 100 other men's breathing, coughing, crying quietly into pillows they didn't want anyone to hear them cry into. I did some of that crying myself in those first weeks. I'm not ashamed to say it now. But I'd spent 40 years running job sites full of men who didn't necessarily want to listen to me, and something in that experience translated in ways I hadn't expected. I knew how to talk to people who were angry. I knew how to diffuse an argument between two grown men before it turned into something with real consequences. Slowly, without really trying to, I became a person other inmates came to when they had a problem, a dispute over commissary, a beef with a cellmate, a letter from home they didn't know how to answer. I wasn't trying to build a reputation. I think that's exactly why it worked. Every single month, like clockwork, Ethan and Olivia requested a visitation slot. Every single month, I told the guard at the desk the same 3 words: I refuse it. I watched the guard's face the first few times he brought me the request, a man named Deputy Warden Pruitt, decent enough, the kind of man who'd clearly seen every version of family tragedy this place had to offer, and who genuinely seemed puzzled by my refusal. "You sure, Callahan?" he asked me once, maybe 8 months in. "They drive 2 hours to get here. Every month. That's not nothing." "I'm sure, I told him. "Don't you want to know what they've got to say?" I remember looking at him for a long moment before I answered. "Not yet," I said. And that was the truth, though it wasn't the whole truth. I wasn't punishing them out of spite, or at least I told myself I wasn't. I needed clarity. I needed to sit in that stillness and let my mind work through what had actually happened that night, without Ethan's voice or Olivia's tears clouding my judgment the way they always had my whole life whenever it came to my son. Word travels strange in a place like that, and eventually it got around that I refused visits every month, which earned me an odd kind of respect from the other men, the ones who hadn't had a visit in years, who envied that I had someone showing up at all, even as they didn't understand why I wouldn't see them. It was around the 10-month mark that I met a man named Walter Higgs. Walter was 71, silver-haired, moved slow because of a bad hip, and had spent 26 years with the FBI before a case gone wrong, one that was never fully explained to me and that I never pushed him to explain, put him in here for 18 months on what he swore, and what I eventually believed was a manufactured charge tied to a former colleague settling an old score. Walter had the kind of mind that couldn't stop working even in a place designed to grind a man's mind down to nothing. We started talking during yard time, 2 old men walking slow laps around a fenced square of dirt and weeds, and eventually I told him my story. Walter didn't say much at first. He just listened the way trained investigators listen, not to respond, but to catalog. Then a few days later, he found me at breakfast and sat down across from me without asking. "Something doesn't sit right about your case." He said, no preamble, like we'd already been in the middle of the conversation. "You said the fall happened at the top of a staircase and a neighbor claims he saw you near her right before she went down. But you told me your daughter-in-law's bedroom and the top of that staircase are on opposite ends of the 2nd floor. How does a man 2 houses away see through walls?" I remember sitting there with a plastic spoon halfway to my mouth, feeling something shift in my chest that I hadn't felt in almost a year. Something close to hope, which by that point I'd been actively trying not to feel, because hope in a place like that can be its own kind of cruelty. "I don't know," I said. "I never thought about it that way." "I did," Walter said. 26 years you start seeing the shape of a lie before anyone tells it to you. From that day forward, Walter and I spent every spare hour we had quietly working the case like it was still open, which to us it was. He had contacts. He could still write letters to old colleagues who owed him favors or who believed as he did that something in the official story didn't add up. I contacted my old lawyer, Marcus Feld, a good man, who'd handled Callahan Construction's affairs for 15 years and who I trusted more than almost anyone outside my own family. I asked him to quietly start pulling records, hospital records, security footage requests, anything he could legally get his hands on. I told him not to tell Ethan or Olivia anything. I told him this had to stay between us. It was around the 14-month mark on an ordinary Tuesday that started like every other gray Tuesday in that place that everything changed. I was called to the mailroom, which wasn't unusual. I got the occasional letter from Marcus updates written in the careful lawyerly language he always used even with me. But this letter had no name on it, no return address, just my name and the prison's address typed, no handwriting anywhere to trace. I opened it standing right there in the mailroom. My hands, I noticed, not entirely steady. Inside was a single line typed in the same plain font as the envelope. "The person who hurt you isn't just your son." I stood there holding that piece of paper for a long time, the noise of the prison around me fading into something distant and unimportant, while one thought settled into my chest like a stone dropped into still water. If that was true, then everything I thought I understood about that night, about my son, about the family I'd spent my whole life building, was about to come apart. Part 3. The secret behind the miscarriage. I didn't sleep the night I got that letter. I lay on that thin mattress staring at the bottom of the bunk above me, turning the words over and over until they lost their shape and became just sounds in my head. The person who hurt you isn't just your son. Not isn't your son. Isn't just your son. Somebody out there knew something and they'd chosen me, chosen that exact moment to say so. The next morning I showed the letter to Walter. He held it up to the light, studied the paper stock, the typeface, even smelled it, once in a way that would have looked comical if the situation hadn't been so serious. "Laser printer, common paper, no watermark," he said. "Whoever sent this knew enough not to leave anything behind. That's not a random act of kindness, Richard. That's somebody who's scared or somebody who's calculating. Could be both." We started from the only place we could, Marcus, my lawyer, who by then had already begun quietly pulling whatever records the law allowed him access to. I asked him to add one more thing to his list, dig into Olivia's medical history discreetly through whatever channel wouldn't raise flags with Ethan. What Marcus found over the following weeks unsettled me more than I expected. Olivia had a documented history of complications in that pregnancy, 2 separate hospital visits in the months before the fall, both related to concerns about the pregnancy not progressing the way it should have. That alone wasn't damning. Plenty of pregnancies have hard patches. But when Marcus requested the full hospital file to prepare it for review, he discovered something strange. Portions of her chart from one of those earlier visits had been amended. Not falsified exactly, but edited in a way that softened the language that made an earlier, more serious warning from her doctor read like routine caution. Someone requested those amendments. Marcus told me over the phone, his voice careful in the way lawyers get when they know they're saying something that matters. Hospitals don't just edit charts for no reason. Someone with legal standing, a spouse, typically has to formally request a correction, and there has to be a reason on file. "Whose name is on the request?" I asked. There was a pause on the line long enough that I knew the answer before he said it. "Ethan's." I sat with that for a long moment in the cramped visitation phone booth, other inmates lined up behind me waiting their turn. The receiver pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark. My son had gone back after the fact and changed the record of his own wife's pregnancy history. Why would a man do that unless he was trying to erase evidence that something had been wrong for a long time, before that night? Something that had nothing to do with me. Around the same time, Walter's contacts turned up something else entirely. The security camera that had been mounted above the Foster's front door, installed ironically at my own suggestion 2 years earlier, back when there'd been a string of break-ins in their neighborhood, had, according to the initial police report, been non-functional on the night of the incident. No footage retrieved. Case closed on that front before it even opened. But Walter, using an old contact who still worked forensic data recovery on the side, discovered that the camera's cloud storage account had actually captured footage that night. It hadn't malfunctioned. Someone had gone into the account afterward and deleted the relevant files, not the whole history, just a very specific window of time. Whoever did that either knew exactly what they were protecting or exactly what they were hiding. The neighbor, Curtis Abelman, the man whose testimony had put me in that cell, became the next thread to pull. Marcus reached out to him gently through an investigator, just to clarify the details of what he claimed to have seen. Curtis, to everyone's surprise, suddenly became evasive. He backpedaled on details he'd stated with total confidence to police the night of the incident. He couldn't quite remember now exactly where I'd been standing. He wasn't sure anymore if he'd actually seen me near her or just heard voices, and assumed. When Marcus pressed gently on why his story had changed so dramatically, Curtis got flustered and ended the call. I remember sitting with Walter in the yard, the Texas sun beating down on the both of us, turning all of this over in my mind. Somebody paid him, I said, or scared him. Either way, that man's testimony wasn't the truth. It was a story someone needed told. The question, Walter said slowly, isn't just who, it's why. Cui bono, Richard? Who benefits from you being in here? That question sat in my chest like a stone for days, because the honest answer, the one I didn't want to look at, directly pointed straight at my own son. While I sat in that cell month after month, Callahan Construction, the company I'd built with my own hands, the company I'd handed to Ethan in good faith, had grown at a pace that, from what little news filtered into me, seemed almost impossible for a company navigating the scandal of its owner's arrest. New contracts. New subsidiary companies with names I didn't recognize. Ethan, according to a brief mention in a business journal Walter's contact had clipped and mailed to him, had been photographed at a groundbreaking ceremony, looking, in the reporter's words, confident and composed. Confident, composed, while his father sat in a 6x8 cell for something he didn't do. And Olivia, the few secondhand reports I got filtered through Marcus, who occasionally still spoke with people in our old social circle, painted a different picture entirely. She'd become withdrawn. She rarely left the house. A former neighbor mentioned almost in passing that she'd seen Olivia crying in her car in a grocery store parking lot, sitting there for nearly 20 minutes before finally going inside. None of it added up to an accusation I could take to a judge. Not yet. But it painted a shape the way Walter had talked about the shape of a lie visible before anyone says a word. It was nearly a month after that unsigned letter that Marcus called again late in the evening, his voice tighter than I'd ever heard it. Richard, he said, I need you to sit down for this. I'm already sitting, Marcus. I've been sitting for over a year. I found something, he said. One of the recovery specialists we hired, she managed to pull a fragment of deleted footage from a backup server nobody thought to wipe. It's not the whole night, but it's enough. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles ached. I've watched it 3 times already, Marcus said. Richard, it's not what any of us thought happened. Part 4. The truth that turns everything upside down. I didn't sleep at all the night before Marcus arranged to bring the footage into the prison for me to view. There's a room they use for legal consultations, gray walls, a table bolted to the floor, a laptop Marcus was permitted to bring in under supervision after weeks of paperwork and a judge's signature. I sat down across from him, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. He just looked at me the way you look at someone right before you hand them something that's going to change the shape of their life. I want to prepare you, he said. It's not long, maybe 90 seconds of usable footage, but watch it carefully. He turned the laptop toward me and pressed play. The angle was from above the front door, looking back into the house through the open floor plan toward the base of the staircase. Grainy, the color slightly washed out, but clear enough. I saw myself walk in through the front door, saw my own face, tired, concerned, exactly as I remembered feeling that night. I heard faintly the raised voices from upstairs, the same argument I remembered hearing. And then I watched myself move toward the staircase, calling up to them, my hand already reaching for the railing. Then Olivia appeared at the top of the stairs, and beside her close enough that when she stumbled, his hand was right there was Ethan. I watched my own body freeze in that footage, watched myself take a step forward, arm outstretched too far away to reach her exactly as I remembered it. I watched Olivia lose her footing. And in that half second before she fell, I saw something in the footage I hadn't been able to see with my own eyes that night because I'd been too far away and too panicked to notice Ethan's hand for just an instant, not catching her, not steadying her, but pulling back, not pushing her. I want to be precise about that because precision matters here. He didn't push his wife down those stairs. But in the argument, in his anger, in whatever ugly moment had overtaken him, his hand came up instinctively to grab her arm and stop the argument, and instead of holding on, he let go a half second before she needed him most, right as her foot slipped. She fell. He didn't catch her. And then 3 seconds after she hit the bottom of that staircase, while I was scrambling toward her, while Olivia was already crying out in pain and fear, I watched Ethan straighten up at the top of the stairs, look down at the scene below him, and then look directly, deliberately up at the camera. The footage cut to black 2 seconds later. Marcus closed the laptop. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. He deleted it, I finally said. He looked right at the camera and he deleted it himself. That's what the recovery specialist believes too, Marcus said quietly. The footage was accessed and removed from an account only Ethan had credentials for. Within the hour, I sat in that gray room and felt something in my chest that I still find difficult to name even now. It wasn't relief though, there was relief buried somewhere in it. The relief of finally knowing with absolute certainty that I hadn't imagined my own innocence. But underneath that relief was something far heavier. My son had watched his wife fall down a flight of stairs, had possibly played some small part in that fall through his own carelessness or his own anger. And instead of accepting any responsibility, instead of comforting her, instead of even checking on his own father who was trying to help, he had looked at a camera and calculated in real time how to make someone else pay for it. There's more, Marcus said gently. I had a friend, a retired obstetrician, review the hospital records I've collected. She says the timeline doesn't fully support the fall as the sole cause of the miscarriage. There were already significant complications documented in the weeks prior. The fall may have accelerated an outcome that was medically already in motion. I put my head in my hands. 2 years. 2 years of my life, my freedom, my reputation gone for something that may not have even happened the way anyone claimed. Built on top of a lie my own son constructed in the span of about 4 seconds at the top of a staircase and then spent every day since maintaining. What do you want to do? Marcus asked. I can file an emergency appeal. We have grounds now, tampered evidence, a recanting witness, exculpatory footage. I could have a judge looking at this within a month, maybe less. I sat there for a long time before I answered. Walter had once told me during one of our long walks around that dusty yard something that stuck with me. The truth doesn't need to be rushed. It only needs to be undeniable when it finally arrives. No, I said. Marcus looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Richard, this is your freedom. This is your name. I know what it is, I said. But if we file this now, it becomes a legal fight. Lawyers delays appeals, maybe a retrial that drags on another year, while Ethan's attorneys pick apart every piece of evidence and every witness. I've already lost 2 years, Marcus. I'm not interested in losing a third one to a courtroom. I want something else. What? I looked at him, and for the first time in almost 2 years, I felt something other than grief sitting in my chest. Something colder, steadier, more purposeful. I never signed over ownership of the company, I said. Only operational control. I'm still the majority shareholder of Callahan Construction. Ethan doesn't know that. He's never had reason to check, because he's been too busy running it into the ground with whatever he's been hiding in those subsidiary companies you mentioned. Marcus sat back slowly, understanding dawning on his face. I need it to happen at the right time, I said. Not in some quiet legal filing that gets buried in a docket. I need it to happen in front of everyone who spent 2 years believing I was a man capable of hurting his own family. Walter later, when I told him what I'd decided, just nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he recognizes a plan built the same way he'd have built it himself. How long until you're out? He asked. I'd already checked that morning the way I checked every morning, marking days on a small calendar I kept folded inside my Bible. 32 days, I said. The day I came home. The morning I walked out of that prison, there was no one waiting for me at the gate. No car idling in the parking lot with balloons tied to the mirror. No family standing there with a sign, nothing like the reunions I'd watched other men have over the past 2 years, the ones that always made something in my chest ache with a longing I tried not to examine too closely. I told Marcus not to bring anyone. I hadn't told Ethan or Olivia I was being released at all. I stood outside those gates for a moment in the early morning light, wearing clothes that felt strange on my body after 2 years of the same gray uniform, and I let myself feel it, the sun on my face, the sound of birds instead of steel doors, the simple, overwhelming fact of open space in every direction. I allowed myself exactly that one moment. Then I got into the car Marcus had arranged and I got to work. We didn't go to my house. We didn't go anywhere near Ethan and Olivia's neighborhood. Instead, we drove straight to Marcus's office downtown, where a small team he'd assembled over the past several weeks was already waiting, a forensic accountant named Priya Rahman, who came highly recommended and who Marcus assured me had a gift for finding money that doesn't want to be found, and two paralegals quietly pulling together every filing, every contract, every corporate document related to Callahan Construction from the past 2 years. Walk me through it, I told Priya once we were settled around a conference table with more paper spread across it than I'd seen in longer than I could remember. What she'd found over the following days painted a picture darker than even I had expected. Ethan hadn't just been running the company poorly, he'd been actively bleeding it. 3 shell companies registered under names that traced back carefully, but not carefully enough, to accounts he controlled personally. Contracts awarded to those shell companies at inflated prices, the difference quietly funneled back to him. Payroll padded with employees who, according to Priya's research, didn't appear to physically exist at any job site. Nearly $4 million by her conservative estimate moved out of the company over 18 months through a laundering structure that was, in her professional opinion, sloppy enough to suggest arrogance more than expertise. He didn't think anyone would ever look, Priya said, sliding a folder across the table toward me. Why would they? As far as he knew, you were gone for good. I sat with that for a long moment, running my thumb along the edge of that folder, feeling something harden inside me that had been soft, foolishly soft, for far too long when it came to my son. I thought about the 2 years I'd spent refusing to see him, telling myself I needed clarity, needed distance, needed time to understand what had happened. Some part of me, I realized now, had also simply been protecting myself, protecting whatever fragile hope I still carried that the boy I'd raised was still in there somewhere, that this was all some terrible misunderstanding I could forgive once I understood it. There was no misunderstanding. There was a man who had let his own father go to prison rather than take a responsibility for a single careless moment, and who had then spent 2 years quietly stealing from the company that man built while wearing his grief and his outrage like a costume for anyone who was watching. I called for a full audit of the board's financial oversight next, and what I found there was almost as troubling: a board that had grown complacent, that had stopped asking hard questions once the money kept flowing in the right direction on paper, that had let Ethan present curated numbers at quarterly meetings without pushing for the kind of transparency I'd insisted on for 30 years, running that company myself. Some of that was on me too, if I was honest. I'd chosen those board members. I trained them in a way to trust whoever sat in my chair without asking too many questions. I spent the better part of 2 weeks like that, quiet, methodical, and visible. I stayed in a hotel Marcus arranged under a name that wasn't mine, technically legal thanks to some paperwork I won't bore anyone with the details of. I met with the company's outside auditors who confirmed everything Priya had found and added several more troubling threads of their own. I met privately with 2 board members I'd trusted most over the years, men who'd known me for decades, who wept, actually wept, when they understood what had really happened that night on the staircase and in the 2 years since. Through all of it, I thought often about Olivia. I hadn't seen her, hadn't spoken to her, but Marcus had quietly maintained contact with a mutual friend who kept us loosely informed. She'd apparently grown more isolated over the past year, rarely leaving the house, no longer working the marketing job she'd once loved. I felt something complicated when I heard that, not quite forgiveness, because I still didn't fully understand her role in any of it, but something closer to grief for a young woman who'd lost a child, and then it seemed lost herself in the aftermath. On the 14th day since my release, Priya laid the final report on the table in front of me, everything organized, cross-referenced, airtight. The kind of documentation that would hold up not just in a boardroom but in a federal courtroom, if it came to that. Marcus looked at it, looked at me, and asked the question I could see he'd been holding back for days. "Are you ready?" I thought about the handcuffs. I thought about the sound Olivia made falling down those stairs and the sound of my own voice telling Ethan, all those months ago, that someday he'd wish he'd never done this. I thought about every visit I'd refused, every month I'd sat in silence while my son and his wife drove 2 hours to see a man who wouldn't even look at them, because I needed exactly this to be ready before I ever let them see my face again. "Call the meeting," I said. "Tomorrow morning, full company, every department head, every board member, no exceptions." Part 6. Everything collapses in 1 hour. The company auditorium hadn't changed in 2 years. Same rows of gray upholstered chairs, same slightly too bright fluorescent lighting, same faint smell of coffee from the machine in the back corner that had never worked quite right in all the years I'd owned the place. I stood outside the doors that morning with Marcus and Priya on either side of me, listening to the low murmur of nearly 300 employees filing in. None of them knowing yet why they'd been summoned on a Tuesday morning with less than 18 hours' notice. Through the small window in the door, I could see Ethan up at the front near the podium, dressed the way he always dressed for these things: tailored suit, confident posture, the easy half-smile he'd learned from watching me run these same meetings for 30 years. He was talking with the CFO, gesturing with his hands the way he did when he was explaining something he wanted people to believe was under control. He looked from where I stood, exactly like a man who had no idea his entire world was about to end. "You okay?" Marcus asked quietly. I looked at him. "I've been ready for 2 years," I said, and I meant it. We walked in together. I don't know that I can fully describe the sound a room makes when 300 people all draw breath at the same moment. It wasn't a gasp, exactly, more like the air itself changed pressure. Heads turned. Whispers rippled backward through the rows faster than I could walk. And up at the podium, I watched my son's face go through an entire lifetime of emotions in about 4 seconds: confusion, disbelief, and then underneath it something that looked almost like fear, quickly buried beneath a practiced professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying awkwardly through the microphone he was still holding. We didn't know you were. This is a surprise." "I imagine it is," I said, and I kept walking up the center aisle, past faces I recognized, foremen and project managers, and administrative staff who'd worked for me for 15, 20 years, some of them with tears already forming when they realized who was walking past them. I reached the podium. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Sit down, Ethan," I said. "I have some things this company needs to see." He hesitated, glancing toward the board members seated in the front row, several of whom would not meet his eyes. Whatever he saw in their faces told him something I could tell he didn't want to know. He sat. I nodded to Priya, who connected her laptop to the projector at the side of the stage, and for the next 40 minutes I walked that room through everything. The shell companies, the inflated contracts, the phantom employees on payroll, the nearly $4 million that had been quietly bled out of a company built by decades of honest labor from the very people sitting in that auditorium. I showed financial records. I showed emails Priya's team had recovered from server backups, emails between Ethan and an account eventually traced to Curtis Abelman, the neighbor whose false testimony had helped put me away, showing a payment of $30,000 routed through one of the shell companies 4 days after my arrest. The room had gone completely silent by then, the kind of silence that has weight to it. I played the recovered security footage last. I watched 300 faces watch my son's hand pull back instead of catching his falling wife. I watched them watch him look up at that camera, calculating before the footage cut to black. Olivia was there. I hadn't known she would be. Marcus had quietly informed her of the meeting the night before, out of what he called professional courtesy, given her standing as a shareholder's spouse, though I suspect it was something closer to giving her the choice her husband had never given me. She sat near the back, and when the footage played, I heard her before I saw her, a broken, quiet sound. The sound of someone finally hearing confirmation of something she'd probably suspected all along and had been too afraid to say out loud. She stood up. Every head in that room turned toward her. "I knew," she said, her voice shaking but carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. "Not everything. Not all of it. But I knew Ethan changed his story before the police arrived. I knew he told them things that weren't exactly what happened. I was scared, and I just lost my baby, and I didn't—" She stopped, pressed a hand over her mouth for a moment, then continued. "I didn't have the strength to argue with him. I let it happen. I let all of it happen to you, Richard. I'm so sorry." I looked at her for a long moment. I didn't have words yet, not for her, not in that room, not in front of everyone. I simply nodded once, acknowledging what it had cost her to stand up and say that. The board didn't need any further discussion. Before the meeting even formally ended, the chairman stood and with a visible tremor in his hands announced Ethan's immediate termination as CEO effective that moment. Legal counsel confirmed all his accounts, corporate and personal tied to company funds, would be frozen, pending a full federal investigation. Someone near the front row had already quietly stepped out to make a phone call. I understood without being told was to the FBI. Ethan hadn't moved from his chair this entire time. When the chairman finished speaking, he finally stood, and for a moment I thought he might try to argue, might try to explain, might reach for whatever version of composure had carried him through 2 years of lies. Instead, something in him simply broke. He walked toward me, past board members who stepped back from him like he carried something contagious, and when he reached me, he did something I never in my life expected to see my son do. He got down on his knees right there on the stage in front of every employee our family had ever hired. And he looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a small boy who'd broken something precious and didn't yet understand it couldn't be fixed. "Please," he said, his voice cracking apart. "Please forgive me, Dad." The greatest revenge. I looked down at my son kneeling on that stage, and I want to tell you honestly what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't triumph, and it wasn't the satisfaction I'd imagined during all those long nights in that cell, turning this exact scene over in my mind, like a stone I kept polishing in the dark. What I felt was grief. A deep, exhausted grief for a boy I had loved since the moment I first held him, for the young man I'd once been so proud to hand my life's work to, and for whatever had happened inside him that let him choose a lie over his own father. "Get up, Ethan," I said quietly. He didn't move at first, still on his knees, still looking up at me, with that broken expression, waiting, I think, for some version of the forgiveness he'd always been able to count on from me his whole life. I'd forgiven him skinned knees and failed classes and a dozen smaller betrayals over the years, the ordinary sins of growing up. This wasn't that. "What you lost today isn't the company," I told him, and my voice, to my own surprise, stayed steady. "The company is just money, Ethan. Money can be rebuilt. What you actually lost, you lost the night you let the police put handcuffs on your father and said nothing to stop it. You lost it the moment you chose to protect yourself instead of telling the truth. Everything that's happened since then, this meeting, the audit, the charges you're about to face, that's not me taking something from you. That's just the world finally showing you what you already threw away yourself." He finally stood, unsteady tears cutting tracks down a face I barely recognized anymore. I didn't reach for him. I didn't embrace him. I simply turned and walked off that stage because I understood, standing there, that there was nothing left for me to say that would undo 2 years, and I wasn't interested in performing a reconciliation I didn't feel for an audience of 300 people. I want to be honest about what came after, because this isn't a story where everything gets wrapped up neatly and everyone learns to love each other again by the end. Ethan was formally charged 3 weeks later, embezzlement, fraud, obstruction, and several related counts tied to the falsified evidence used against me. His legal team has been fighting it since, and I understand it may take years to fully resolve. I testified once in a deposition, calmly, factually, the way I've learned to say difficult things without letting them undo me. Olivia filed for divorce within the month. She reached out to me privately weeks later, not asking for anything, just wanting to apologize again, this time without an audience, without the pressure of a room full of witnesses. We talked for a long time that day about the baby we'd both lost in different ways, about fear, about the different kinds of silence that had nearly destroyed both of us. I don't know what our relationship will become. I know I don't hate her. I know that took some time to arrive at, and I'm still not entirely there with Ethan, and I'm not sure I ever fully will be, and I've made peace with that uncertainty. I sold Callahan Construction 4 months after that meeting to a company I trusted to keep the name and take care of the people who'd built it alongside me for 30 years. I didn't need the money at my age, and I found once the sale went through that I didn't want to spend whatever years I had left running a company at all. Instead, I used a portion of the proceeds to establish a small scholarship fund named for the grandchild I never got to meet, supporting young mothers facing medical complications during pregnancy who couldn't otherwise afford the care they needed. It felt like the only kind of justice that baby deserved, not vengeance, but something that might spare another family the particular kind of pain mine went through. The rest of my time now, more than I ever expected, goes towards something I never planned for. Walter and I, once he was released a few months after me, started working together with a small nonprofit that helps wrongfully incarcerated men and women rebuild their lives after release. Not just the legal work of clearing their names, though we do plenty of that, but the harder, quieter work of helping them find jobs, rebuild relationships, remember how to trust the world again after it failed them so completely. I understand that particular kind of disorientation now in a way I never could have before all this happened. I understand what it costs a person to come home to a life that moved on without them, and how much it means when someone simply believes you. If there's one thing I've come to understand sitting with all of this in the quiet years since, it's that revenge was never really what I was after. Even in my darkest nights in that cell, even when I refused every single visit and told myself I was simply waiting for the right moment. What I actually wanted, I think, was for the truth to survive long enough to matter. Real justice was never about destroying my son. It was about making sure he had to live long enough and clearly enough to watch everything he built on top of a lie come apart in front of the people whose trust he'd spent his whole life earning. That's the only kind of revenge worth having in the end. Not the kind that leaves nothing standing, the kind that simply refuses to let a lie stay buried forever. I don't know exactly where this story goes from here, honestly. Ethan's case is still working its way through the courts. Olivia and I are still finding our way toward whatever relationship makes sense for two people who lost the same thing in different ways. I'm still learning most days how to hold on to both the grief and the peace at the same time, and I'm starting to believe that might just be what the rest of this chapter of my life looks like. I wanted to share this with you because I think a lot of us carry some version of this story quietly, a betrayal by someone we trusted completely, a truth we had to wait far too long to see come to light. If any part of this reached you tonight, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what this story stirred up in you. Leave a comment below and let me know. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you, so please subscribe so you don't miss a single moment like this one. Let's keep this journey going together.